All right, well, thank you all for coming out this evening. I want to thank Tim Townsend and Justin Blandford for putting together this intriguing series of programs. I'm honored to be here tonight to moderate this panel. But before I introduce our panel members this evening, I want to say a few words. We are living in a time of really important anniversaries. May 2014 marked the 60th anniversary, of course, of the landmark Brown versus Board of Education decision. July 2nd, 2014, we're going to mark the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. As we'll talk about tonight, that may very well be the most sweeping civil rights legislation ever passed by Congress. But I want to talk about an anniversary of a different sort. Notice where we are this evening to kick off this program, the Lincoln Home National Historic Site. What does Abraham Lincoln have to do with our discussion tonight? Next year, 2015, marks the 150th anniversary of the Lincoln assassination. Why was he assassinated? What motivated his killer? On April 11th, 1865, 2 days after Robert E. Lee surrendered to Ulysses S. Grant at Appomattox, Lincoln gave his final speech from a window at the White House. His assassin was in the audience. What does Lincoln say in that final speech? It was a very sober speech in which he focused on what was coming next. The war was, for all major purposes, over. Reconstruction was coming. What would the Civil War mean? What would be the fate of the freed slaves? In that speech, Lincoln said, we're going to have to readmit the 11 former Confederate states back into the Union, but first, they've got to do a few things. Their citizens must swear a loyalty oath to the Union. They need to revise their state constitutions to forever abolish slavery. And he suggests, while they're at it, while they're rewriting those state constitutions, they should also allow black men to vote. Not all black men, Lincoln suggests. African Americans who served in the Union Army, and, quote, the very intelligent. We think Lincoln means literate African American men. That was the first time in Lincoln's public life that he had ever endorsed the idea of black suffrage, albeit limited black suffrage. When his assassin heard Lincoln say those words, he became enraged. He turned to his companions and he reportedly said, that means black citizenship. Didn't say black. He used a racial slur. That means black citizenship. Now, by God, I'll put him through. That's the last speech he will ever make. And Booth murdered him 3 days later. As Professor Michael Burlingame has pointed out on so many occasions, Booth didn't determine to kill Abraham Lincoln after he issued the Emancipation Proclamation 2 years earlier. He hadn't decided to kill Abraham Lincoln after he endorsed the 13th Amendment. Booth's thoughts turned to murder because Lincoln called for black voting rights. In Professor Burlingame's eloquent words, quote, therefore, it seems to me appropriate that we consider Lincoln as much a martyr to black civil rights as Martin Luther King, as Medgar Evers, Andrew Goodman, James Chaney, and any of the other champions of civil rights who were killed in the 1960s. In the decades that followed the Lincoln assassination, civil rights advocates used Lincoln's memory to draw a parallel between the civil rights struggle and the unfulfilled promises of emancipation, and Reconstruction. I'll give you just a couple examples before we begin tonight. In 1939, singer Marian Anderson was denied the opportunity to perform at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C. because she was black. Where did she perform instead, do you know? At the foot of the Lincoln Memorial. When she was introduced to the crowd of more than 75,000 people, the speaker said that Lincoln had given his life to free the slaves, and today, at his memorial, this, quote, glorious tribute is rendered to his memory by a daughter of the race from which he struck the chains of slavery. The concert then became much more than just a musical performance. The Lincoln Memorial was an incredible symbolic stage, and it would remain so throughout the Civil Rights era. And of course, we're most familiar with 98 years after Lincoln's death on August 28, 1963, more than 200,000 people converged at the Lincoln Memorial to hear Martin Luther King's eloquent speech. Remember, that speech began with an allusion to Lincoln and his most famous act. Quote, 50 years ago, a great American, in whose symbolic shadow we stand today, signed the Emancipation Proclamation. That momentous decree came as a great beacon of hope to millions of Negro slaves who had been scarred in the flame of withering injustice. It came as joyous daybreak to end the long night of their captivity. Like Lincoln did at Gettysburg, Martin Luther King was rededicating the country to a new birth of freedom in pursuit of the old dream immortalized in the nation's founding document. That phrase you might have heard, all men are created equal. So that's why we're here tonight at the Lincoln Home National Historic Site to talk about the Civil Rights Act of 1964, because even though he was martyred nearly a century earlier, before this significant piece of legislation was passed, whenever we talk about civil rights, whenever we talk about delivering on the promises of Reconstruction or living up to the nation's mission statement, we think Abraham Lincoln is relevant to that conversation. So I thank you all for coming out tonight to participate in this discussion. I want to introduce tonight's panelists. Dr. David Joens. He has served as the director of the Illinois State Archives since 2004. A former newspaper reporter, he worked as press secretary for the Illinois Senate Democrats for 7 years. For 3 of those years, he served as press secretary for the Senate's Black Caucus. Dr. Joens has his undergraduate degree from Northern Illinois University, 2 master's degrees from the University of Illinois Springfield, and a PhD from SIU Carbondale, where he specialized in Illinois history. He's the author of several articles on Illinois history and politics. Most recently, he's the author of the book From Slave to State Legislator, John W.E. Thomas, Illinois' first African American lawmaker. Come on up, Dave. Our next panelist is Dr. Matthew Holden, Jr. He holds a PhD in political science from Northwestern University. He is currently the Wepner Distinguished Professor in Political Science at the University of Illinois Springfield. Dr. Holden has previously taught at the University of Virginia, where he was the Henry L. and Grace M. Daugherty Professor Emeritus of Politics. His wide-ranging scholarly interests, many of which are directly related to the legacy of Abraham Lincoln, include public administration and policy, public law, urban politics, and race and politics. His 1974 book, The White Man's Burden, is a classic in the early political scholarship on race and politics. His much-anticipated next book is titled The World and the Mind of Isaiah Montgomery, The Greatness of a Compromised Man, which examines the lone African-American delegate in the Mississippi Constitutional Convention of 1890. Come on up, Dr. Holden. And our final panelist is Dr. Angela Winand. As an undergraduate, she earned degrees in political science and American history from the University of New Orleans. She came north for her graduate work, earning an MA and a doctorate in American culture from the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor. Dr. Winand has taught a number of courses in the African American Studies Department at the University of Illinois Springfield. And her current research sounds fascinating. She's interested in a computer program called Second Life. She's working on a study of representations of race and gender in the virtual world. I want to hear more about that. Dr. Winand is currently a Curatorial Assistant at the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library and Museum. Welcome, panel members. I've prepared some questions. I hope these questions are going to give us an opportunity to explain why the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was both so necessary and such a significant piece of legislation. We're going to allow some time at the end of tonight's program for any questions that you might have. Hold those questions until the end, and I will promise you I will leave some time at the end to address some of your questions. But I want to begin tonight by setting the stage for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. I think we could best do that by going back to that critical period right after the Civil War. What were the promises of Reconstruction? What would America have looked like under the plans of the so-called radical Reconstruction? What were the promises of Reconstruction, panel? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I'll start. Well, it's kind of, in a way, it's difficult to say, especially in 2020 hindsight. My background's with Illinois history, and in Illinois, the promises seem to be unlimited. Slavery had ended. In Illinois, before the Civil War, there'd been a large focus on civil rights because African Americans in Illinois were free. So while they often lobbied, obviously, to end slavery, in Illinois, they were concerned about the black laws, which were violations of their civil rights in Illinois. You couldn't own property. You couldn't be on a jury. You couldn't testify against a white man. And the most heinous by the end is you could not even emigrate to Illinois, and you had to pay a $1,000 bond previous. And if you couldn't show proof of that bond, you could be imprisoned and fined. If you couldn't pay that fine, even if you'd been free your entire life, you could be sold into slavery. Those are the black laws in Illinois. So Illinois came to the Civil War with a long tradition of African Americans. One name I would encourage everybody to remember is a man by the name of John Joens out of Chicago, who led the fight to repeal the black laws in Illinois. And they had a long tradition of working together to repeal the black laws. In Illinois, there were a couple of what they called colored conventions, 1853 and 1856, where African Americans in Illinois, even though they didn't have the right to vote, would get together, meet, discuss civil rights, repeal of the black laws, again, even more so than slavery. And they get together, discuss it, and petition the government that didn't allow them to vote, I might add. So when the Emancipation Proclamation happened, I know in Chicago and elsewhere in the state, African Americans had huge celebrations. They had on New Year's Eve when the Emancipation was going into effect, they had waiting parties, and then at churches throughout the state, especially a large one in Chicago, waiting to get the telegraph that said the bill has been signed, because of course the president had said in September that he was going to sign it on January 1. So you go forward to 1865, slavery's ended, and the expectations were extremely high at this point. And they found out rather quickly it was going to take a little bit longer. They were free, African Americans were freed, but they didn't have the right to vote, and they wouldn't get the right to vote till 1870. And one of the big things when it comes to civil rights is in the United States and elsewhere, you need the right to vote. You can't have civil rights without the right to vote. And as early as 1845, John Joens, even as slavery is in charge of 95% of African Americans in the country, even as early as 1845, he's saying we need the right to vote. We need the right to vote. So until 1870, so that 5-year difference between the end of the Civil War and 1870, you're getting a cold dash of reality that it's not going to be that easy. It's not going to be that quick. And you'll notice, to tie that into the Civil Rights Act, they passed the 1964 Civil Rights Act, huge piece of legislation, but the next huge piece of legislation and equally necessary was the 1965 Voting Rights Act. They go hand in hand. So I think the expectations following the emancipation, the end of the Civil War, the freedom, were extremely high. And again, my background in Illinois history tells me there is a large experience group, I guess, of African Americans who really expected things to change, and it took a lot longer. And actually, in some ways in Illinois, things got worse. So their expectations weren't met.
My comment is a little more succinct because I think.
I apologize.
No. I don't. Forgive me. I don't mean to. I think we can make too much of this, or maybe it depends on the point of view you bring to it. For a good deal of the former slave territory, and from what I understand, Illinois was not unlike this in some of the things I'll mention. Life much more complicated at the same time, much simpler. The ability to have and keep a gun and not have somebody invade your house and take away your gun. And the gun not only for hunting, but for self-defense. We may get a chance to talk about the episodes about 10 years after the war in Warren County, Mississippi. Vicksburg, the Vicksburg area, for any of you who've been to the Vicksburg cemetery. The opportunity to acquire and keep a piece of real estate. Long before you vote, you simply have to eat. And you must either work for somebody else or cultivate your own. The ability to send kids to some kind of school. There's very interesting documentation from Mississippi, I've seen some from Georgia, I suspect it's true elsewhere, but people who are barely literate enough to write a sentence could find some place to construct a schoolhouse, and having discovered that there were some places from which people would send teachers, would write a letter saying, "We've built a school, please send us a teacher." I'm sorry, I have a citation in mind because I've written something about this where anyway, wants to send me a message, I'll give you the precise citation for that one. That kind of thing. All of this is sort of pre-political in the sense of voting and so on. But the voting part was not unimportant either. And that had, and I'm saturated in Mississippi, that had in the Mississippi case to be enforced by the United States Army. Now, the United States Army was of some consequence in Mississippi for only about, in real terms, maybe 5 or 6 years. I'll say more about this maybe at some other point, because the troops found themselves being shot at from all sides in the dark and sometimes in the daylight. Now, that's not terribly surprising. Most people in this room don't look to me, unless they were of officer rank, to have been young enough to have been in Iraq recently. But the young men who've been in Iraq and the young women who've been in Iraq know something about that business. That was Mississippi, God knows. And it took that to enforce such franchise as was exercised. But so to speak of promises of Reconstruction, Sam, that's a little high-minded. That's a little philosophical. It's a little intellectual. And it makes me think in much narrower terms than that. But some of those things, now, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, I'll jump ahead and say the Civil Rights Act of 1964 is in effect the negation of the common agreement that the country reached in the late 1890s. I think the country reached a common agreement that Lincoln was dead. Secession was no longer a real question, and it was no longer practical or worthwhile to be too much worried about the colored people. And from that, the reunion of the blue and gray, about to read, is a negation, if I may put it in these terms, of the blank. That's late 1890s, early 1900s. That is not under challenge until the 1930s. The product is another 30 years of this, that, and the other that gives us 1964. And another way of saying it, since we began with reference to Lincoln, and I meant I wouldn't have done this anyway. Abraham Lincoln as president had only 3 problems. I'm not as much of a worshiper in the Church of Lincoln as Professor Burlingame. As president, he had 3 problems. Problem number 1, the challenge that every president before him faced, the problem, the threat of secession or negation of presidential authority. Everybody faced that. Number 2, he had to deal with the question of chattel slavery, which every president before Lincoln either had to tolerate or actively promoted. All of the 15 before Lincoln. And number 3, he had to deal with the question of, well, what happens with the blacks once they are freed? My view is different from what others may hold. I think President Lincoln never really grasped precisely what he was dealing with. Most of us have big problems we don't know what we're dealing with. And it is true that, there's a 17th century poet called James Webster, who refers to, has a passage which says that death lays its icy hand on kings. Well, death laid its icy hand on Lincoln, and he never had a chance to grapple seriously with what he was dealing with. That's at least my way of thinking about it.
Well, I am willing to take on some of the philosophical tones of your question, Sam, and say that when I think about the promise and the vision of Reconstruction, I come to that vision not only on the basis of my personal background being from New Orleans, but also as a scholar of New Orleans history, which is what I do in my first life when I'm not hanging out online in second life. And using New Orleans as a lens for thinking about the period of Reconstruction, what we are able to see, in addition to the importance of the right to vote and the practical concerns that you were addressing, Professor Holden, is the symbolism behind the particular New Orleans community known as Creoles and the free people of color there represent their history in a social sense as well as in a political sense, represent that middle ground. The place that they're in New Orleans are starting from a place of being able to talk about African Americans or people of African descent who are already literate, who already have a history behind them of military service, of social service and community service in their neighborhoods in terms of working with churches, building their own schools. And of course, we do have to be attentive to the fact that there are reasons why they had to build separate schools, separate churches. On the one hand, a choice to create community, but on the other hand, a recognition that they were being forced or prevented from participating in the already existing institutions that may have served white French-speaking, and we don't want to forget that either, counterparts. The French-speaking part actually, as I get older as a person, becomes more important because that this separate heritage is able to operate, even though it's always operating in tension with an English-speaking white American identity. So people of African descent in New Orleans are always dealing with that as part of their cultural experience, cultural expression, whether that's food, music, all of the things that New Orleans is known for. Behind those public things are these lesser known things. And when we take the time to look at that heritage, we can see where other free people of color in other urban areas, whether that's Charlotte or Charleston or Philadelphia, what they were also thinking about. It's like, we are citizens and we want these newly freed African Americans who have a slightly different experience. We recognize that they're connected to us, and we want to also have a role in bringing them into the body politic.
Thank you all so much for those thoughts. A lot of things happened during those comments. We got a Illinois, we got a Southern perspective on the promises of Reconstruction. As Dr. Holden rightly suggests, there are fundamental issues about the promises of Reconstruction. Land ownership, voting rights, education, those are fundamental issues, absolutely. Dr. Joens, I want to shine the spotlight on you for the next question here. Who was John W.E. Thomas? Why don't Illinoisans today know who he was, and why should we know who he is?
Well, John W. Thomas was, there's a new book about him, by the way, that talks about it.
Who wrote that book?
That I don't know, an up-and-coming author from what I understand.
Could we get his autograph today?
Sure, sure.
My version is on Kindle, though. I don't know what to do about that.
It's good to know I'm on Kindle. John W. Thomas was the first African American to serve in the Illinois General Assembly. Came to Illinois, he was a former slave, came to Illinois 1869, was elected to the General Assembly in 1876. And I might add, it is interesting hearing the different viewpoints because, again, my background, Northern African Americans who had different needs and issues than Southern African Americans. And it is kind of interesting hearing the different discussions there. So Thomas stepped into a body politic in Illinois where there was a small but vibrant African American political community. Again, a guy named by the name of John Joens is somebody worth remembering. He was a loyal Republican, and again, very intelligent. He had been educated in the South, and he was very intelligent. When he came to Illinois, he took advantage of all the opportunities that were not available in the South. He went to business college, for example. He opened up his own grocery. He opened up his own school for African Americans. He went into politics. Opportunities that, again, just weren't available down south. In 1875, the federal government passed the Civil Rights Act, a huge piece of legislation, so much dwarfed by the 1964 legislation, kind of almost a dying gasp, you could say, of the abolitionist movement. But it was passed in 1875 that allowed prohibited discrimination in public accommodations in public places. And that was to be the law of the land. Well, the Supreme Court in 1883 ruled against that and said basically that the federal government could not regulate states and that this bill regulated states. So it was a state prerogative, I guess. So much different than what happened in 1964, I might add, where the federal government is passing the Civil Rights Act because the states are not enforcing civil rights. But in 1883, when that was disallowed by the Supreme Court, it was a huge, huge blow to the civil rights movement. But individual states up north began to pass their own civil rights legislation. And in 1885, Thomas, as the only African American in the General Assembly, introduced, and got passed the Illinois Civil Rights Act of 1885. So that would be his legacy. So that's who John Thomas is. The Civil Rights Act of 1885, good piece of legislation modeled on the federal piece of legislation, but it was not enforced very often. Like a lot of laws, again, which kind of necessitated the need, well, definitely necessitated the need for the 1964 Civil Rights Act and the federal government to step in, because in Illinois, the Civil Rights Act was not enforced. Discrimination obviously continued. We know the stories. In 1874, the schools of Illinois were desegregated on paper. In the 1850s, they were desegregated in Chicago. But again, at the state level, these laws are being ignored. So Thomas did what he could at the state level, and it was landmark legislation. But just because you have a law in the books doesn't mean it gets enforced.
Excellent. It's a name we should become more familiar with, definitely.
Simon, is it premature of me to ask Dave for a follow-up question on this?
Please do, Dr. Holden.
Dave, I'm always curious. When a piece of legislation is adopted, there has to be some tolerance for it, some acceptance. Illinois had such a pervasive pattern of active racial discrimination all through the late 19th century. I'm just curious how it turned out to be practical at the same time for Illinois legislators to adopt such legislation that no state's attorney was going to bring any case to implement, and pieces of legislation that we know were actively violated, I'll come to one eventually, when cases were gotten all the way to the state Supreme Court. How did that happen? It seems an obvious contradiction, yet it happened. Why?
Well, Illinois didn't become as segregated or even as racist till 1890s, 1900s. I mean, there was always racism, discrimination. I mean, absolutely and obviously. But the farther north you went, you still had civil rights activists, both white and black, passing the legislation. There were cases that were brought to the courts. There were cases that were punished. But as time went on, and in the 1890s, Edward Morris, a legislator, African American legislator, passed legislation that strengthened the law a little bit. So again, was able to get it through the legislature. I think where the dichotomy comes in a little bit is Illinois was such a unique state. The southern part of the state in Illinois is very southern. I mean, Alexander County, it's farther south than Richmond, Virginia. The northern part of the state, settled by Yankees, immigrants, a lot more liberal. I think, again, you'd see cases there that went to court and were enforced. Again, I know Edward Morris defended one case, but as time went on, you see an increase in racism. I think one of the issues up north, the African American population in Illinois was so small. It was unique just to see an African American if you lived in Illinois until the Great Migration of the 1910s, 1920s. It's not something that applied to everyday life. It's an easier vote to take that way, I guess. You see racial lines hardening so much. You see this law ignored so much as time goes on in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, where it's again, the lines just hardened. So I think at the time, there were people the schools of Chicago were desegregated. This law was, at times, could be enforced. Mostly it was not, but at times it could be. Mostly cases weren't brought up because it was assumed it couldn't be enforced. So it was not a be-all, end-all. It certainly wasn't going to end discrimination. A law is not going to end discrimination. It's not going to end what's in people's hearts and what their feelings are. But it is, you do get something that's on the books, and it was put in a little bit.
Interesting.
So we have the retreat from Reconstruction. We usher in this era of Jim Crow. And what I want to talk about now, right before we talk about this significant piece of legislation, I want to talk a little bit about the modern day civil rights movement. What do we mean by this civil rights movement? The movement was multifaceted, filled with different groups, sometimes competing agendas, complex personalities, in that movement that we like to talk about. But I want to ask the panel, what were some of the key constituencies, the key groups that made up the so-called civil rights movement? I'm thinking now about black churches, organized labor, women, students in particular. What sort of observations come through in your research on this?
Go ahead. I'll defer.
Okay. And you can have the final word.
I promise to be quiet.
Well, Sam, as we were thinking about this panel and exactly what it was that we wanted to discuss, I remember our intern Joy saying that the thing that stands out to her for the civil rights movement is that it's a grassroots movement. Mm-hmm. And that indeed seems to be an important point that we want to remember and reflect on. When we talk about the civil rights movement, when we look at the beginnings of protests among African Americans in the southern states, the Montgomery movement is sort of a key coming together of a lot of different representative constituents. And the Black church is a key focal point, not only for bringing those people together, but also expressing what it is that people wanted and coming up with the tactics and strategies for making this grassroots movement function. As you said, we've got student groups coming from largely HBCU campuses, historically black colleges and universities, in Mississippi and Tougaloo being a key center for thinking and talking about what to do. But we can also think about the roots of what begins to happen in the 50s and 60s as coming out of the labor movement of the 30s and talk about the different communist affiliated groups that came out, but also popular organizations that some of which were New Deal led or had New Deal origins, influencing later groups that were important in the 60s movement, groups like CORE. And do I need to recap what that acronym stands for? Congress of Racial Equality was one of the first groups to lead boycotts of transportation. In the 60s, it's CORE that's responsible for the Freedom Rides and joins with other groups to conduct the Freedom Summer in the summer of '64. We can talk about the role of the NAACP, and we want to also stress the fact that in the 1940s and 50s, throughout the South, the NAACP is often made ostracized. It's illegal for African Americans in some places to publicly affiliate with the NAACP. At the same time, there are people working very hard to maintain memberships and try to establish chapters and keep them going. In the 30s, trying to keep them alive through the 40s, bringing them back to life in the 50s. And so they also play an important role. We have a number of organizations that come out of the Black church, and I think the main acronym that we want to remember here is, of course, SCLC, which is the organization that becomes affiliated with King, Southern Christian Leadership Conference. And it's through this organization that you have various church congregations and preachers who are considered leaders not only in their churches, their individual congregations, but leaders in their different communities. So whether talking about New Orleans or Jacksonville, Florida, or towns and throughout Mississippi, throughout Arkansas, coming under this rubric. There are also individual congregations, and I think about a figure like Fred Shuttlesworth, who was so important and instrumental in Alabama, giving King an example to follow and sort of giving King, I guess, a sounding board in some ways. Let's see, did I touch all of those bases in terms of constituencies? But I'm sure there's There's many more ways that we can slice up and identify those constituencies coming together. I don't want to say that I've given a total answer, but I've started the answer.
Just real quick, I want to jump in just real quick because then we'll let Dr. Holden go. You raised such a good point. The civil rights, again, I'm bringing my 19th century views up, was probably never going to happen in the 19th century. But one of the problems with it was not ever grassroots. It was always top down. It was passing legislation, like Dr. Holden mentioned. Okay, we've passed a law, but there was no grassroots. And that is such a good point to mention that I just felt the need to take it as my own.
And we want to make those distinctions between what happens in the 19th century and what happens in the 20th, but we always also want to make connections.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting. I may be the dissenter here. Interesting, and I think it's more than a matter of temperament. You give me wonderful, optimistic things. You want somebody to say, nah, tain't so. Invite me.
We did.
Human beings, in my opinion, are human beings. Mostly selfish, mostly lazy, mostly going to stand behind somebody else. And the more contentious that somebody else is, the further behind they're going to stand. That's as true of African Americans as it is of anybody else. And I think we have, from kind of a book point of view, a glorious view of the civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. And as far as I'm concerned, there never was any such thing until perhaps in the 1950s, when the combination of radio, television, and the interest of radio and television practitioners that projected things on such a scale that lots of people were drawn in, partly as participants and partly as spectators. Now, the effort to pursue the interests and rights of persons is a much older enterprise. There is never a decade and never a year in which somebody is not trying to pursue something that is of serious interest, but it is very, very difficult for a variety of reasons. Difficult because it's often physically dangerous. Physically dangerous, let me give you a story. Everyone should know the name of a man called Walter White. Walter White's long since dead. He was a middle-aged man when I was a youngster, which is a long time ago. He was the executive secretary of the NAACP. He was to, you understand genotype and phenotype? Physical inheritance and physical appearance. Phenotypically, Mr. White was as white as or whiter than anyone in this room. There was no doubt. And Mr. White, when he was a young man on the NAACP staff, went to Arkansas in a complicated case, and he writes that he was I think Helper. The book in a book called A Man Called White. Is Helper? You know what you're talking about that. And some man he did not know passed him and looked at him in a way that caused him to follow the man. And the man said to him, in effect, a black man, I don't know who you are, but you better get out of here, because they intend to do something about you. And White went, it was near train time, and he went on sort of the wrong side of the train and got on the station and paid for his fare with cash, and got to Memphis and checked in somehow with his office. And they told him they were glad to hear from him because they had already heard that he had been caught and hanged. My point only is that serious things could be very, very serious. It was also expensive. There was a woman called Daisy Lampkin, who must have long since dead. When I was teaching at the University of Pittsburgh in the 1960s, Ms. Lampkin came. She was quite senior as a staff member in ACT by then. She came to a meeting, and the story she told was of getting this phone call from Walter White. She was out soliciting membership. And he told her, hurry up and get some more membership because we need the money. But his membership was a source of revenue. There were other sources of revenue. So the activity, now this is the period in which, if you read law books, NAACP is involved in cases that are precedent to Brown against Board of Education. Gaines against Missouri is a law school case. Sipwell against Oklahoma, I think, is another. A whole bunch of them. And they go back into the 40s, the 30s, the 20s. Very serious activity that a small number of people are somehow carrying on. Movement? No movement. The movement balloons at a certain other time. That's one piece of it. Another piece, the black churches. I grew up in a Baptist family with 1/4 AME. When I hear about black churches, I say, oh, come off it. Now I understand, I have enough experience with churches, it's true elsewhere. You get 10 clergy, 10 churches, very competitive, all very self-interested. 2 of them are interested in something serious besides their church business, and one of them actually does something. These days I'm an Episcopalian. This is true for Episcopalians, but there's so few Episcopalians, it's not worth mentioning. So it's not merely black churches. The wonders of the black church, I just say, let's not exaggerate that. Notice how few people remain active once something has hit a crescendo. Not much. That's one other little thread. It is quite common in current academic literature to give a certain amount of credit to communist-affiliated organizations. Those who come up in my generation, trade union connected, hard-line anti-communist to this day. And we reject that view. We don't think that Walter Reuther and the United Auto Workers, who were an important part of the financing, had anything to do with the CP. We know better. And I know what the fight was in the United Packing House Workers, which my father was about. So that you're going to see a scuffle amongst the academic people, the book writing types after a while, because I'm getting tired of this stuff that the communists came from somewhere and motivated something and saved us from the rest.
Well, I wasn't claiming that for the Communist Party as activists so much.
But Pat Sullivan is.
No, you're right.
All right.
There are some who do. I guess I tend to think of it as all of these different strands are important as an intellectual influence behind that motivates, for example, the law cases that the NAACP fights. You have to have these different arenas where people can talk about, well, how can we challenge these laws and why should we challenge these laws? I mean, to come up with the language about how to do it, you have to have spaces where you can discuss it. And the party for African American intellectuals was one of the few places that blacks could actually talk about those things. But I do hear what you're saying about those same intellectual discussions weren't necessarily political activist discussions, in the sense that they wouldn't claim that as an identity. Not everyone did.
Not by a long shot.
But you would have to look at Chicago or Harlem to see or be able to say that there were African Americans meeting in communist-led organizations and actually choosing that as their way of being activists. But one of the reasons I think of the Black church story as being so compelling is because rather than focusing in on whether individual clergy or individual congregations are fully standing behind the movement, is the fact that the ones who do create a space where those congregations sing, preach. I always like to tell my students about the fact that I like to remind them of the fact that when we celebrate the March on Washington, we have to also remember that it's taking place in a Jim Crow city. So part of the strategy that had to be planned was simple things like, how are people going to be fed? If 500,000 people are going to come out, or 250,000 people are going to show up, or whatever the number is, and of course academics argue about that too, still to this day. How are they going to get fed? Where are they going to go to the bathroom? Where are they going to sleep? How are we going to get all of these people from Philadelphia, from New York City, from Chicago, from Jackson, Mississippi, from Houston, Texas, up to Washington, D.C.? And so you have to have the women of the church, the sisters of the church are the ones making cheese sandwiches and making sure that people have a place to sleep and that they get from point A to point B. And so the logistics there, and the fact that all of that planning happened is still amazing to me.
Could I add one other thing?
Yeah.
I started out appearing to take my distance from the political side, and I may appear to contradict myself. I don't think I am, but I don't forget the vote in a very simple way. I do wince a little when I hear the Great Migration. I wince when I hear all these grand concepts. I think that people, ordinary people, doing ordinary things, but you have to put some name on, so they call it the Great Migration. The Great Migration produced a lot of votes in Chicago. The votes in Chicago made it politically attractive. Chicago, Indianapolis, etc., made it politically attractive for people who are running for office to pay attention to them, whether they liked them or not. Chicago Democrats, for the most part, didn't particularly like them, but they did vote. And out of that came a stance inside the Democratic Party. Not identity, but a stance, a relationship that pushed Democratic national politics into some kind of connection with the Civil Rights Movement. Despite the fact that I said something slightly discourteous about the movement part. So that the civil rights activity was crucial by 1948 to the election prospects of Harry S. Truman. And I think if we went back and looked at the way congressional votes were recorded, you probably had Illinois Democratic congressmen who supported civil rights activities legislation 16 years before it could be passed, even though in their towns and counties, nobody felt very nice about that. I've thought a lot about the brief tenure of Scott W. Lucas. I don't know if anybody knows that name but me. but Scott W. Lucas from Havana, Illinois, as the Senate Majority Leader, who had to wrestle with filibuster problems when these issues began to come to the Senate side. But they had a lot of importance to the administration. So this stuff sort of builds up year after year. Now, it took 16 years from 48 to 1964. 16 years and a lot of other things. But that belongs in the mix somewhere.
Dr. Holden, I wouldn't say that the contradiction is in you. The contradiction is in the situation that you just described. On the national level, the Democratic Party does indeed have to be pushed to deal with civil rights, but they realize that there's as you said, a bonus in it for them. The other reason they have to be pushed is because the Southern Democrats are still so powerful as Democrats who are discriminating and keeping African Americans from participating in party politics. That bargain that the Democratic Party is willing to make in order to make sure that their candidate wins the presidential election gets weaker and weaker as we get through the World War II period and into the 60s.
Yeah, no, you're right. Let me add an Illinois ingredient to this. Angela refers to the importance of the Southern Democrats. I'm going to deal with the Senate side only. Forget the House for the moment. It's just as important. Robert Caro, who's written how many books about Lyndon Johnson?
He's pushing 5.
All right.
Yeah.
Robert Caro, in one of the books about Lyndon Johnson, describes the occasions when the Southern Democratic senators, when they were still all senators, there were 22 of them. And on some occasions, when they really wanted to dramatize the point, all 22 of them would walk together into the Senate. Which is to say, there is no way that anything is going to pass if all of us object, unless all of you are going to be on the other side, and you all don't really want to do that. Now let me add a little twist to that. I referred to Scott W. Lucas from Havana, Illinois. There was another Illinois senator. I think he took Lucas's place. Did Everett Dirksen beat Scott Lucas? Anybody know Illinois political history well enough to tell me?
That I don't know.
I think Everett Dirksen beat Scott Lucas. Everett Dirksen was not a big supporter of civil rights legislation. But 1964, if you all have never seen the video or didn't see it yourself, very few of you old enough to have seen it yourself, but the video shows up on TV documentaries, when Dirksen gave this marvelous speech about nothing can stand in the way of an idea whose time has come. Now, what the importance of this was that they would no longer have Senate Republican support for the filibuster. And without the ability to have the filibuster, the legislation, there were enough votes for it to go through. All this is some part of what's happening that maybe I'm interested in that part. It resonates with what I'm really interested in, and wonderful ideas leave me cold. But you tell me how things are done, I'm very interested.
I have monopolized all of the questions up to this point, and I am going to open up the floor. Does anybody in the audience have a question for our panel about anything we've talked about for the better part of the last hour? We've contextualized the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Anybody have a question?
Or a comment.
Or a comment, absolutely.
Or even criticism.
Now, let's not go too far.
I have a fundamental question that I'm going to throw to the panel. Why was the Civil Rights Act of 1964 significant? What did it do?
It did a lot of things. The first thing it did was it made illegal under federal law the widespread practice of racial segregation across the country, north and south. All right? It made illegal, under somewhat complicated terms, the common practice of racial discrimination in hiring and firing. Start there.
Mm-hmm.
These were not, this wasn't small potatoes.
Yep.
It did not handle very well, interestingly enough. It did not handle very well the voting problem, which was basically a Southern problem. And that's why you get the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
Right.
That changed a whole lot of other things. And there must be pieces of the law that I've long since forgotten or didn't refer. It also, by the way, introduces the gender question in a way that, as far as I understand the record, I think it's actually correct. If someone says that I'm wrong, I'm willing to hear this, to believe it, but give me the citation. That when a provision of outlawing discrimination on the basis of race, creed, or color, and Edith Green of Oregon put in one other word, sex. And the Democratic leadership, when she did so, was very uncomfortable with it. In part because they were sure that was going to make it a loser. But having thought about it and having promised some of the lobbyists or whatever who talked to her, Green did not feel that she could back out or back down. You know, members of legislatures face that problem all the time. And so that the leadership, whether they liked it much, didn't really feel they could humiliate her. And they let it stay. And it turned out to be a political winner.
I'm looking forward to hearing Clay Risen talk more about this in one of the upcoming sections in the series. The role of Dirksen, I hope, will be addressed in his book. I haven't gotten all the way through it yet.
Mr. Risen will be speaking on June 19th.
Okay, 2 weeks from now.
So a significant, trailblazing piece of legislation that opens the door to further significant pieces of legislation. As we begin to think about the legacy of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, maybe we can just end on this note. We've talked a lot about a civil rights movement itself. Does the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 validate the civil rights movement? Does it tell us anything in particular about the civil rights movement itself?
Another point that I like to make when I'm teaching about the civil rights movement, in addition to what you were describing earlier, Dr. Holden, about the impact of television and radio to cover the movement, to make the events that are happening, whether it's marches, other protests, seem larger than life, is the fact that we've got this baby boomer generation of people willing to work to change the world. Northern college kids coming down to the South to work. Southern blacks who have been living through generations of Jim Crow, inviting them into their homes, feeding them, talking to them, working with them, and violating the racial etiquette of the South in doing so. To me, that's a big piece of why the civil rights movement makes the impact that it does. That you've got this large number of people, but that you've got this generation that is idealistic in what it wants to achieve, but willing to do the work to make it different. And it's because the civil rights movement happens that we get a women's rights movement and a gay rights movement and changes to the Constitution and allowing 18-year-olds to vote and so many other things that are so meaningful in that period of time.
And I think, and people still point to that, to the movement. They don't point back so much to Brown versus Board of Education. They don't point back to Harry Truman desegregating the military. What you see today, people are always looking for a movement. They're looking, not always, I'm overgeneralizing here, but that's what they point to when they want change. They look at the movement. They see success out of that, rightly or wrongly. But they see that high water mark, and that's what's wanted in the women's movement. That's what's wanted in the gay rights movement. That's what they point to. And after 50 years, they're still pointing to that.
Dr. Holden?
I'll keep my dissent to myself.
Oh, I thought for sure you were going to say something good there. All right. Well, does anybody else have any questions for us as we wrap up tonight? Thank you all very much. I want to thank our panel very much. Let's give them a good round of applause.